Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Thank you, President Althea. Last week, Tom Gemmell reached out to me about having a speaker for this week's meeting. And in addition to, Tom said he saw a podcast recently on sharing the bad news and thought it would be a great program for our Rotary Club. Well, of course, we're going to say yes to Tom, so I also wanted to check the weather forecast. And you might say, what does the weather forecast really have to do with the Rotary presentation? Well, at Hospice and Community Care right now, this is what we refer to as Auction Week. And if I was not here right now, I would be in the back of a tractor trailer unloading probably tables and chairs and everything else. The weather forecast said it was going to be 92 with a heat index of 102. Thank you, Tom, for the invitation to be here today. I greatly appreciate it. And I also want to encourage anybody to come out to the Labor Day auction this weekend. It is a great time. It's down at Solanco Fairgrounds, Saturday and Monday. It's an amazing fundraiser. Last year we raised over $740,000, and thank you to many of you who are a part of that through sponsorships or individuals. But over 6,000 items will be put up for bid before this is all done on Monday evening. And the food is awesome too. The Amish community does all our food. So if you have some free time, come on out and enjoy the weekend. Now, to introduce our speaker today, her bio is in the transmitter, but there's some things you can't see from that bio. Dr. Joan Harrold is truly recognized as one of the top hospice and end-of-life care physicians in the entire country. She joined our organization in 1998, just about 3 months before I joined, and when she started, our census was about 150 patients a day. Today, we're taking care of 520 patients. And she deserves a lot of credit for that increase. We are now the largest hospice in Pennsylvania, and based on the last check of Medicare records, we are the 49th largest hospice in the country. Her expertise is a large part of that because once she joined us, it took the credibility of the hospice program to an entirely different level in the medical community around us. So we are very, very fortunate to have her with our organization. She also oversees palliative medicine consultants. That's the formal name for our physician practice. We have 23 providers underneath of Joan, 12 nurse practitioners and 11 additional physicians beside her that provide the palliative care for York Hospital, Lancaster General Hospital, Ephrata Hospital, and Barshinger Cancer Center, as well as our outpatient clinic. So we are very pleased to have Joan Harrold here today to speak. Joan?
President Althea, Rotarians, thank you very much for the invitation. As Steve said, it's Dr. Gemmell's idea that we talk about this, and I appreciate from him also, as well as an idea for a title. He sent a podcast for me to look at, which I had not seen before, but included a physician that I knew of well, who really pioneered how we handled delivery of bad news in medicine. What I did not know, however, is that this particular physician, Rob Buckman, and you'll see some things from him here, actually was an amateur comedian and worked with John Cleese. So I should just say Monty Python there and you'll get it right. Not because this is funny, but because he understood the connection that people need to make to hear what you're saying. And he understood that you have to think about how you're going to be heard, not what you're going to say. Now, this sounds like a pretty clinical topic. I don't want it to just be clinical, although I'm going to give you the clinical background. But I'm going to tell you that this past weekend, I had to tell my 16-year-old son that one of his dear friends died unexpectedly and tragically. I took what I know from delivering bad news clinically and used pieces of that to think about what I was going to say. So what I'm bringing to you today is the medical clinical part, but I'm also going to highlight some things that anyone can think about if you have to give somebody bad news. Now, it may not work in absolutely every circumstance, but there are things to think about that just because we do it in medicine around clinical things, what Rob Buckman did, drawing on his experience as a comedian, trying to connect with someone so he would be heard, are things that you can use if you've got to connect with someone so they hear something that they don't want to hear. And frankly, that you don't want to tell them. So, with that sort of background, let's talk about delivering bad news and, in some respects, responding or helping someone who's gotten bad news. One of the things I learned, and I don't know if I'm in your way or not, so one of the things I learned from the podcast about Dr. Buckman was a little more around how we used to do this and how medicine didn't necessarily teach it well. In fact, we taught it badly. In the 1847 original Code of Ethics from the American Medical Association, it was said that it was not the role of physicians to make gloomy prognostications. And as late as 1951, the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, suggested that people give evasive or confusing answers to patients who have cancer and are asking questions, or their families asking questions about prognosis and how long they have to live. And there were quotes such as, talk about an ulcer or an infection. Some people would say a tumor, but don't use the word cancer. So we've come a long way. We get to the 70s and the 80s, and people are starting to think we need to be more truthful. We need to talk more about what's going on. We need to not hide behind the jargon and the medical ease and the big words that can be rather confusing to folks. In a study in the 1980s, they polled over 1,200 Americans. Some of the studies were done in Europe, but this was done here in the United States. 96% said they would want to be told if they had cancer. A vast departure from what we would have had 100 years ago. And 85% said that if they had a grave prognosis, they would want to know that, and they would want a rough estimate of how long they had to live. So society was changing, medicine was changing, and we needed to do a better job at telling people things that were hard to hear. However, the practice of deceiving patients intentionally couldn't just be turned into, as it was said in this quote, a new routine of insensitive truth-telling. That's not better. It's not helpful, and it's not caring. There have actually been studies on why it's so hard to deliver bad news. Now, I have to tell you, as a human being, I don't understand why we need studies. We all know it's hard to deliver bad news, but there have been attempts to say, what's the problem in medicine around this? I mean, it's our job to look for bad things. Sometimes I think my kids have to be reminded, my job is to look for what's wrong and then try to make it better. Because my daughter has said, why are you always starting with the negative? It's like, because I've got to find out what's wrong before I can make it better. I have to work on that as a mom, but as a doctor, it's not a bad thing. So what do we know about giving bad news in clinical medicine? We know physicians are not comfortable doing it. We may do it a lot, but we don't necessarily like it. Doctors have said that they're afraid it's going to rupture the patient-doctor relationship, that the patient will feel somehow that they don't care about them, or that they're not as interested in them, or that they won't trust them because they gave them bad news. Some physicians have said they're afraid to take away hope. We'll come back to that one in a minute. They just don't know how to do it. Some folks have said it takes too much time. We just don't have enough time to do this anymore. Or I just don't have enough experience. I'm not good at it. Well, to be perfectly fair, it's not going to be easy. It's bad news. It's hard to do. But in the grand scheme of things, what we rather bluntly sometimes tell medical students and residents, it's not about you. It's about the person you're talking to. Most people want to know. It can strengthen the relationship if you do it well. If the patient and family trust you, then that contributes to hope. You aren't taking away somebody's hope by caring about them, caring for them, and giving them the information they need to do as well as they possibly can. And if we give people the information they need, then they in turn will tell us what's most important to them, so we can give care that helps them meet whatever their goals might be about what's most important to them. So that we can, in fact, not be threatened by giving bad news, but instead provide more support and more help to the patients that we care about and care for. So one of the things that Dr. Buckman did was he came up with a methodology, something to help us teach and then remember how to give bad news. But it's not quite so strict that we get into a circumstance where people feel like that they have to do it one way or the right way, because you can imagine having a physician come in, or anybody else for that matter, well, I've got something bad to tell you, but I've got to think about how to tell you, and then not telling you. That's not helpful. So the first rule, clinically, from Dr. Buckman's standpoint, was before you tell, ask. I'm going to tell you that from my standpoint, the corollary to that in medicine is don't just do something, stand there. Figure out what's going on. Don't just react. You don't even know what you're reacting to unless you understand the situation. Dr. Buckman had a lengthy quote about we're trying to separate the message from the messenger so they feel supported from the messenger, that being the physician. But really what it comes down to in some respects is, at least at the beginning, it's not about the words. It's not about having the right words. We'll talk about words, but it's about a whole bunch of other things. There are multiple different methodologies now for delivering bad news, and they all come with different mnemonics. There's break and other things. The original, though, is spikes. Now, I had to share that with you because that's hardly warm and fuzzy. I mean, it just goes against the whole idea of what we're trying to do here if it's spiky, but it works from a mnemonic standpoint. So we're going to talk about each of these pieces. And as we do, you're going to see that I've highlighted some of them in red. We're going to come back to all of those because those aren't clinical. Those are just human and talking to people and thinking about what you might use in whatever you do, professionally or personally or with family or with friends, if you're in a position where you've got to deliver bad news. So when we start with the S, making sure I'm together here, it's setting up the situation, setting up yourself, making sure that things are in fact set to have a conversation. This may be pretty elaborate from a clinical standpoint. A physician needs to gather the information about the patient's illness, the test results, different things. It could be somewhat time consuming. Part of it is also setting yourself up. And I'm going to suggest to you that if you know you have to deliver bad news, that you're ending up having to do that, think about your first sentence. You don't want to write a speech. It can't be scripted entirely. Part of this is relationship. It's conversation. It's not a monologue. But having that first sentence in mind is a really good way to start. When we're doing this clinically, we want to know who else should be in the room. Sometimes you can do this from an office standpoint and say, we're going to have your test results when you come back next week. I'm not real sure what we're looking at here. There's a possibility it may not go the way we hope. Who else should be here so that I can tell you and somebody else the information and what's going on? Who else should be with us? Sometimes it's harder to do that in a hospital setting because maybe somebody's at work. Maybe somebody hasn't arrived yet when the physicians or the nurse practitioners or the PAs are making rounds. But you can say, I've got some test results that I think we need to talk about. I'm expecting to get all of them back by the end of the day. Who's going to be here who should be part of this conversation? From the standpoint of your being a family member of a patient, you can be thinking about if someone is likely to be getting results that could go badly, making yourself available, or thinking about who else should be there. So some of this, while it's the physician's job to do some of this, you can also be thinking, if you're not the patient, if you're involved one step away, how this should go. We encourage people, if possible, to use a quiet location so you can be heard and not be distracted. But most importantly, try to be at eye level. If you've got children, grandchildren, if you've worked with children, one of the cardinal rules is get down on their level if you've got something important to say. And the same goes any other time. So sit down and as much as possible be at eye level with somebody. Silence phones, and as much as possible allow adequate time. And this is very important. Sometimes you don't have time. I understand that. We're going to talk about making time, or making it feel like you've got time in a minute. When people get bad news, their perception of time changes. I've had patients and family members and other people say to me, it just felt like time stood still. It just felt like I was in another world. It just felt like I wasn't there. Time perception changes. So one of the things you need to do is slow down and leave some spaces so that people can catch up and hear you. From a clinical standpoint, the physician, clinician, whoever it is, frequently wants to ask a question to find out, what does somebody already know? Why did you come to the hospital? What's your understanding about what's going on with your illness? It can sound a little scripted, but it's important. It's pretty important if I'm walking in with test results about whether somebody's disease has spread and is worse, and chemotherapy or their cardiac meds are not helping anymore, if they think they came in to have a procedure to fix them. We're not starting in the same place. So it really is important to ask, tell me what you know about your condition right now. Tell me where you understand things are right now. While it may sound a little odd, get an invitation to find out what it is the patient wants to know. Now, understand, I'm not advocating in any way avoiding the truth, evading the truth, withholding the truth, or being paternalistic. What I am saying is, patients sometimes want to know different things. Now, I'll tell you, I talked with my husband about this talk, and he said, I don't understand. What do you mean what the patient wants to know? You need to tell the patient everything. I said, well, I had a patient in hospice once. Now, understand what I just said. The patient was in hospice. The patient was actually at the hospice inpatient center. There was no question in the patient's mind that he had a terminal illness. And I went in, and we had done some things, and I said, well, I wanted to talk to you about whatever it was. He said, the only thing I want in this room is good news. If you've got anything negative to say, go out in the hall and talk to my daughter. Now let's think about this for a second. He's in hospice. The likelihood of my having really good news is pretty slim. But he had the right to say, I don't want to hear it. You can bring good news in here and you can take bad news out there. But what he did, and had he not done it, I would have asked, what he did was give me someone I could tell the whole thing to. And that's okay. And we have folks who will say, you know, I can't concentrate on all that right now. Just tell me this. Is it better or is it worse? And can we do something about it or not? So some people want to know everything. Some people want to know a general idea. And some people are like my patient who only wanted joy and light in his room. And if there was anything that was going to darken the day, it needed to be taken elsewhere. That's okay. Critical. If you take nothing away from this except one thing, it needs to be this one thing. Fire a warning shot. You need to fire a shot across that bow. They need to know that there's something coming. Now, from a clinical standpoint, it could be the test results are back and they're not as good as we had hoped. It could be if someone wasn't expecting anything bad. We've got some serious things to talk about that maybe you weren't expecting. We need, from a clinical standpoint and from a personal standpoint, to avoid technical words, jargon, euphemisms. We need to use clear, simple, unmistakable terms. And understand that even if you are perfectly clear and you speak slowly and the words are short, 1 or 2 syllables only, somebody may still need to hear it again. Time changes. Perception alters. You have to give people space, small bits of information so that they can absorb it and move on to the next piece. And then stop talking. Really. Just stop. That's part of that space. It doesn't have to be an hour, but you have to tell yourself to stop and give somebody a chance, because you know what? You knew the news before you opened your mouth. They're just getting it. Silence is hard. Just stop talking. Just give them a little bit of space. Little bit of space. And then whatever emotion you get back, be gentle with people. I tell my kids, you have to be careful with people. People are important. This isn't about the words. This is about the person you're giving the words to. From a clinical standpoint, we try to teach medical students and residents to say, I can see this is upsetting. I can see you're sad. I can see you're distressed about this. What we would rather they not say is, well, it's normal to feel this way. We can normalize emotions, but people don't like to be told that what they're feeling is either normal or abnormal. But we can say, this is difficult. I know this wasn't what we were hoping for. I wish things were different. I wish the news was better. And then the conversation from a clinical standpoint may go in different places. And from a personal standpoint, it may also go in different places. So if you're wrapping up, if you're not going to continue to be in that conversation, if you need to separate from the person that you were talking with, 2 pieces that may be helpful that we certainly do clinically. 1, summarize what we've talked about. Tell me what it is that I've said so that I make sure I said it correctly. It's called teach back in medicine. And then strategize about what comes next. Sometimes that's going to be really simple. Sometimes you've got everybody in the room you need and the patient wants to hear it. And sometimes they're done. That space that you created, you realize they can't get out of that space. They're done. And you need to plan to come back tomorrow and talk about what's next. Now, the risk here, of course, is that when people are uncomfortable, they try to make themselves more comfortable. And what's interesting from a human being standpoint, for medical professionals, for physicians, we tend to go into jargon and medical speak. It's somewhat depersonalized. It's clinical. It's easy for us to rely on that. But unfortunately, not only do we go into medical speak, but we can do what other people who aren't clinical also do, and that is we just keep talking. And we don't stop. And we just keep going. As a resident, I was not taught how to deliver bad news. But I tried really hard to be forthright with people. So at 3 a.m, when I was on call one night, I had a patient who'd been in the intermediate intensive care unit. I was in another state, but in the intermediate intensive care unit, had been there for several months, had gone into cardiac arrest several times, had CPR several times, had been resuscitated, but had not gotten out of the hospital. And unfortunately, once again, He went into cardiac arrest, and we, as we say, coded him. And he didn't survive this time. He died. And I'm the third-year resident, and it's my job to call the family at 3 a.m. And I did. And I remember writing some notes and thinking, okay, I'm very sorry to call you. And I think it was his aunt, so I'm going to use that. Your nephew had another problem tonight. His heart stopped again. We've done everything we can. I'm so sorry. But it didn't work. And there was a long pause. And she says to me at 3 a.m, "That's terrible. How is he now?" I could have used this because what I thought was perfectly clear and actually not jargon, I didn't say that he's died. I needed to be clear. I needed to not be afraid of the word that really described what she needed to know. So somebody may respond with all kinds of reactions, all of which are perfectly fine. Don't get hung up on the 5 stages of grief and think somebody skipped something or they're in the wrong order. There's no order. It's more like a ping pong ball. It just sort of pings around. But you do have to be clear. Because it's not about the words until it is. So I told you it was about the delivery. It's about the relationship. And it is. But there are some words I'm going to offer to you to not say when you need to deliver bad news, or if you are now talking to someone who has received bad news. Don't say these things. You're a fighter. You just need a positive attitude. It's God's will. There's a reason for everything. You're never given more than you can handle. And you can see the rest of them. One of my favorites is somebody who's got 5 physicians taking care of them in the hospital. Have you gotten a second opinion? We say these things sometimes because we've heard them, because we want to be encouraging, because we want to be helpful. But if you think that one of these things is getting ready to come out of your mouth, really, just stop. It's not that you're not trying to be helpful. It's that those things, those words, patients then tell us, people later tell us, it wasn't helpful. And sometimes they tell us it hurt. So what can you say? You can say, I am so sorry. This is so hard. What I thought was fascinating about Dr. Buckman, and one of the things that made him so good at this delivering bad news piece, is that early in his career, he had a chronic illness that appeared to be leading to his end of life. He was dying. And he vividly remembered and told the story when one of his physicians finally said to him, "This is hard." And he felt like someone finally gave him permission to be honest about the fact that, yeah, this is really crummy. Because everybody else wanted him to be upbeat, go get him, you can beat this, and kind of ignored the fact that this is hard. And then I'm going to offer you this piece. If you're looking to be helpful, and you can be helpful today or tomorrow, then say, what can I do for you this afternoon? When people say, call me if I can do anything, that universe is so big that unless you're family and you're someone that this person can actually yell at or fuss at, that the relationship's that good, they don't know what to do with that. Be specific. I have told people, okay, I'm going to come over tomorrow if that works for you, and while I'm there, I'm going to take care of the cat boxes. Anybody have cats? Nobody likes to take care of cat boxes. Be specific. So, I told you pieces of this that don't have to be clinical, that you can use if you need to deliver bad news. Have the information at hand as best as you can. Be as prepared as you can. Know your first sentence. Sometimes you don't get a lot of grace and time to do that. Sometimes things are happening pretty quickly. But at least try to come up with your first sentence if you can. Do these other things. Fire that warning shot. I started by telling you I used these things this weekend. Before I walked out of the house to go get my son from work, he's 16, I knew what I was going to say when I picked him up. I knew one sentence. After that, I had no idea. My one sentence was, honey, I've got some really bad news about a friend of yours from school. Why? Bad news. I narrowed it down to friend from school. Had I started with, oh my God, something terrible has happened, where do you go with that? Is it dad? Is it grandmother? Is it my sister? Is it the baby? I mean, is it 9/11? There's so many bad things that, oh my gosh, something terrible has happened. Be a little bit more specific for people. And then create some space and stop talking. As best as you can, boil it down to this. Prepare, be clear, be quiet, and be there. That's what Dr. Buckman was trying to tell us. And it doesn't matter if you're a physician and you're talking about clinical stuff or it's any other bad news, you can do these things and make it go as well as it can for something that may be not good at all. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Otherwise, I turn it back over to your president.